All right then. Hello everyone. My name is Kyle Jenkins, and I am secretary for Why Should I Believe? And I am going to be talking about explaining, hoping to shed some light on the ontological argument for the existence of God. Okay, so first a little bit of history. This is a very old argument, and it was first formulated by Anselm of Canterbury. It was about 1078, I believe. And how he went about it is he first said that God is that which nothing greater can be conceived. Basically, think about anything, the best thing that you can think of, that's God. Of course, some of that was, there was some more added to that, to how can that be an argument for the existence of God. Well, he said that the greatest possible being must exist in reality if it exists in the mind. So basically, if you can think of something so great, but it can only exist in your mind, there must be something greater that actually exists, that has all the properties of what you think it is, but it exists in reality, not just in your mind. There are a lot of objections and issues with that argument, even though I would say personally, I think that is a very one of the most elegant pieces of reasoning in human history. That is not the most robust form of the argument. There are lots of little problems with that. One of them that I can explain very easily, Immanuel Kant said, existence isn't a property. You can't say something has or does not have the property of existence, because if it doesn't exist, it has no properties whatsoever. So Anselm's argument doesn't hold water. However, many iterations, several different people looked at the argument, thought about it in different ways, and most recently, the philosopher Alvin Plantinga, who's at Notre Dame, I believe. Yeah, Notre Dame. He formed a modal iteration of the argument. This is a lot more of a robust argument, a lot more tight-knit, a lot less holes. Okay, so I was naming all these things, talking about this big argument, and admittedly it is a lot more philosophical in nature and much more difficult to understand than some of the things that we do talk about here. And so we're going to define a couple of terms. First, what is ontology? It's the ontological argument, after all. So what does that mean? Well, ontology is the study of reality, being, or existence. So what that entails for the argument is it's basically an argument for the existence of God, given a particular nature of God that we all say would apply to such a being. And in this particular argument that I'll be talking about, it's important to know what does modal mean. So modal logic is just normal logic, but it's applied to something called conditionals. And so instead of the normal propositions and premises and conclusions of logic, say water fills its container, this container holds water, therefore this water is filled with. Okay, hold on. Let's see. All right, dogs have 4 legs. This creature has 4 legs, therefore it is a dog. That's bad logic, but that's just an example of statements following to a conclusion, whether it's faulty or not. However, modal logic includes conditionals, which is saying if something happens, then something else. So I have a good day when it's not raining. If it's not raining, then I will have a good day. That's an example of modal logic. So we got Anselm's definition of God, and this is more or less just a little bit more clear what he means. For the purpose of this discussion, I'll be defining God as a maximally great being. And a maximally great being is some being that possesses all great making properties to their greatest degree and possesses no lesser making properties. What these mean, a greater making property is anything that is good to have as a being, a person. So something like power, knowledge, love. These are all good things to have. And so a maximally great being would have all of these. They would be omnipotent. It would be this being would be omniscient. This being would be omnibenevolent. And a maximally great being would also have no lesser-making properties such as corruption or ignorance. Things that you could say, oh, that's bad for a person to have. A maximally great being would not have that. And as we'll get into more the situation, into the details of the argument, it'll also be important to know that a possible world is not literally some planet or world out in the universe. It's just a philosophical term for some hypothetical set of circumstances that could have come about. And necessary, or necessity as a greater making property, says it is better for something to be necessary, that it cannot fail to exist if it does exist. There are a couple of different things that objects or beings could be. They could be impossible, such as a square circle or a married bachelor. These things are logically incoherent and they don't make any sense and therefore don't exist because they are impossible. There are also contingent beings, those that can exist but don't have to. We are all contingent beings. We did not have to be born. We did not have to be here in this exact situation. Also things that don't exist, or we would say don't exist, such as unicorns or dragons or something like that. They could exist, therefore they are also contingent even if they don't actually exist. But God would be an example of a being where if it is possible for him to exist, he cannot not exist because he is necessary. So this is the actual argument. It starts off with the premise, it is possible that God, a maximally great being, exists. And it follows from there each premise from the next. If it is possible that God exists, then God exists in some possible worlds. If God exists in some possible worlds, then God exists in all possible worlds. If God exists in all possible worlds, then God exists in the actual world. And if God exists in the actual world, then God exists. That seems not very convincing. It's a little heady. It seems it's kind of just a verbal trick. But let's examine it a little closer. So the first one says, it is possible that God exists. And as a maximally great being, he would be necessary. So if the first premise is true, then that means God is not logically impossible, and so he could exist. There's some possible world where he could exist. That's the second premise. Some possible world exists where any being that is not logically impossible could exist. So if there's some possible world where God exists, then if it's possible that he exists in some possible world, that he could exist. And if he exists in some possible world as a necessary being, he cannot not exist. So if it's at all possible that God exists, he must exist in all possible worlds. There is no world where he would not be part of that circumstance if he's not logically impossible. And so if he exists in all possible worlds, then he exists in the actual world, since the actual world is technically a possible world. It is a possible set of circumstances. It just so happens to be the one we are in. And so if God exists in the actual world, then God exists. So how does this hold? As far as I can tell, this argument is coherent. None of the statements are faulty, logically speaking. It's always just a logical extension of the previous premise, given the terms that we defined earlier. As such, the only possible objection that can be the only objection that can be leveled at this argument, the only premise that is controversial, is the first one: is God actually possible? And so, in order for this argument to fail, one needs to prove that it is actually impossible for a maximally great being to exist. Because if it's not impossible, then the argument holds, and therefore God exists. So there are a couple of objections. There are many more that are less widely used, a little more, a little over my pay grade to be discussing and explaining to you all. But here are a couple of the ones that are leveled and are very, very common. The first is the omnipotence paradox, which is, I'm sure you've heard before, can God create a rock that's so heavy that he can't lift it? The idea is that if God can't create such a rock, then he's not omnipotent. But if he can create a rock, but then he can't lift it, then he's also omnipotent. However, the problem with this is that the argument, this objection itself is absurd. Power does not mean the ability to do all things. It's just efficacy or being able to act effectively within, to enact your will. And so it's not possible for someone to act against their will. It's impossible for someone to contradict themselves. So a lesser definition of omnipotence is what actual theists believe. It's not the ability to do anything, even the logically impossible. God can't make a square circle. He can't make a married bachelor. It's not possible. It's logically absurd. And so this objection just can be discounted as logically absurd. It doesn't make any sense given that we have used modal logic. It rules out logical absurdity. The next question is the illogical problem of evil. This was formulated first by David Hume, and the basic gist of it is evil exists, and so therefore a good and loving God is impossible, since a good God would, or a good all-powerful God, a good God would want to get rid of evil, an all-powerful God would be able to get rid of evil. However, evil still exists, therefore a good, loving, and powerful, all-powerful God is impossible. I won't dwell on this too much, but suffice it to say that the logical version of this issue is not really taken seriously anymore, mostly because there is some possibility that there could be some reason that God is still allowing evil. The example of that would be, say, in Christianity, God says he allowed the murder of his son, but then he used that to bring his people to himself, to save them from their sins, as an example. And so, while there are issues with the problem of evil that need to be wrestled with, the logical problem does not make God impossible. There's also the problem of imperfection, which is basically a different rephrasing of it, saying God is imperfect and cannot create imperfection. However, the world is imperfect. Therefore, God could not have created the world. But all that means is, if this is true, then all that you can get from this argument is that the world could have become imperfect. It's not necessarily such that God actually created it imperfect. There's still the possibility that God created it perfect and then something happened. And so this objection also does not cover all of the possibilities to say that God is truly impossible. And then there's another objection that I believe was mainly raised by Hume. If there is no empirical evidence for God, he cannot exist. However, part of his nature would be to be outside of space, since a maximally great being would be better to always exist. And so in our world, it would be that would transcend our universe. He would be outside of the physical universe, and so therefore it doesn't make any sense to try to look for empirical evidence for God. He's beyond the call of science to either prove or disprove. There need to be other reasons to look for his existence or non-existence. Run through this fairly quickly, but I hope that it's not too difficult to understand, and you can always ask me questions. However, if you do understand this argument and or at some point do do understand it, and hopefully I can help with that. This argument is not actually technically persuasive. The first premise, it is possible that God exists, and the conclusion, God exists, given the definition of God as a maximally great being, is essentially repeating itself. It's not supposed to be technically persuasive. It's more to demonstrate that God as a maximally great being is rational through deductive logic. It's supposed to explain God's character and his nature, not necessarily say he exists, since the very first premise is a conditional itself. However, we can say that God is not impossible, and there are other reasons that we've talked about in the past. If you've been with us, and if you continue to be with us, we'll probably talk about in the future. There are other reasons to suppose that God is possible, such as different forms of the teleological, moral, and cosmological arguments for God. All of them are excellent arguments and are worthy to be looked into further. All right, so I ran through this very, very quickly, but is there any questions that anybody has? The time is open for you guys to ask me questions. Yes?
Just to make sure I have like the logic of it right. So basically it's like with anything there's always going to be like a maximum, so there's always going to be like a maximum amount of greatness, so therefore if God's defined as like the maximally great being, it has to be a maximum, and therefore God exists is kind of like the premise of it. Or
more, not necessarily saying there is always a maximum. That would be more Anselm's argument. God, it's more to say God is a maximally great being, and he either exists or he doesn't, and whether he's possible or he's impossible. And so, and again, if he is possible, he must exist by his nature as a necessary being. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then can you like elaborate on like the necessary being part again?
Yeah. Okay, so explaining a little bit better, there is three kinds of, when you're talking philosophically about objects or beings, things that have some relationship to existence. Some of them are impossible. They can't exist in any possible world, like a square circle or a married bachelor. They just don't make sense. Contingent beings are anything that can be conceived that might exist. That means us, we might not have existed, which is to say the same as we might exist. And also things that we are fairly confident don't exist, such as unicorns or dragons. There is some possible world where they might have existed. And that is, and so they're also contingent. They might exist, they might not. However, necessary being means that there is no possible circumstance where they wouldn't exist. There is no way that the history of the world or the history of reality could have panned out, I guess you could say, where a necessary being would not exist. Another example of a necessary object would be a number. The number 2 is the number 2. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. There is no possible world where the number 2 is 3, except for very large values of 2. But it's the necessary means it has to be the way it is, regardless of where it turns up. And it will always turn up if it's not impossible. And so God as a necessary being would always exist, regardless of how the world panned out, unless he is impossible, in which case he would not exist at all in any possible world.
Okay, and then like in like the ontological argument, like what is like given as a reason for God being necessary, just like that a creator has to exist, or does something similar?
No. The reason, again, like it's not, as I said, it's not technically persuasive. However, you go into the argument knowing that God is a maximally great being. That's his definition. And so, again, what I just explained to you would follow through. Mm-hmm. Or any other questions or objections? That's fine too. Yes?
Is it really appropriate to use such rational arguments for a potentially maximally great being? Seeing that, the parameters we have for, like you just said, that you told Grace that basically the creator being necessary isn't necessarily what we use for proving that God is necessary. And yeah, I did that. And so, like, then what is? I mean, can we really create parameters where we can really measure the necessity of a being to say that God is necessary?
Maybe one way to say this is to not think of it necessarily in strictly Christian terms or in terms of a specific theistic worldview or religion. This is more or less actually just saying God or some maximally great being exists. Whatever that maximally great being actually is like in the details is not the concern here. One thing that you might say that does get it a little bit closer to Christianity at least is saying a great making property is love. But love is something that is expressed between two people. If there's only one being, then how can God, a maximally great being, exist without and have love if he's the only being there? To which I would say, well, the Christian at least has a response. Not sure how other religions would. And the Christians would be able to say, well, the Trinity is describes the nature of God. God is Trinitarian, and so all of the persons love each other, and so that's how a maximally great being is able to express love without getting too much into the Trinity. I guess the only way to say this is not this is more natural theology or philosophy, not strictly a religious argument, is the best I can say.
Could I ask one more thing?
Yeah, absolutely.
The love argument, but what about self-love?
I can't say on that. I guess you could say this then. How, like again with the not only is a maximally great being having all great making properties, but also to their greatest extent. And while there may be, whether self-love is a form of the great making property of love, the good thing of love, I think it would be also true to say that the better form of love is to love another person rather than yourself necessarily. So I guess that's the main response there. To which and whatnot, but even then, that's only saying more religions than Christianity can adequately say that God can have love for himself.
You're just saying the kindness of God. One more thing. It seems like you're really trying to say that we should have a standard for these excellent properties, and that the standard would fulfill it to the highest. And since these things involve personhood, deductively that person would be the highest standard, and that would be God. Is that what you're trying to say also?
Could be. More, I mean, it's not implied here. I mean, the very first premise again is it is possible. And so we're all saying, sort of taking off of Anselm's, but without saying it's true. You could say you can conceive of some greatest being or greatness, greatest extent of a great making property, like a omnibenevolence or an omnipotence, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that it actually exists, if that makes sense. This comes here saying that a maximally great being exists. It is possible that he exists, not that we can imagine the greatest extent of these things, and therefore there must be a standard. That they're talking about different things. Yes.
I want to respond real quick to you about self-love without diving into heresy. There's a point at which self-love and I guess you call it pride separate. Like there's a limit. You can have self-love without it being a bad thing. The most quoted attribute of God in the Bible is, at least in the Bible first, is His holiness, and that it comes from an expression. God understands what exactly He is, and being able to express that in a way that is not overstepping His own bounds, but is entirely appropriate as a description of God. So I think that God is allowed to have self-love, just as humans can have. Like, I can love myself, but I understand that if I love myself too much, it becomes pride, it becomes haughty, and like that's a limit that's a little too far. But so essentially, you started touching on it. God exists in a Trinity. God is a community of one, of three, which is interesting. And in that, each person of the Trinity shares the same will, shares the same love, shares the same goals. So in that form, God is able to love Himself and contain self-love at the same time, but without going too far to become pride or haughty, I would say.
Yes.
Okay, so I've heard that this ontological argument can only be applied to God because only God is a maximally great being, so we can't apply it to unicorns or anything because they're not maximally great beings. So from my understanding of the argument is that we know that there's a maximally great being because we have humans as people have a conception of a maximally great being that do induction, that it then points to the existence of a maximally great being. So my question is that the evidence, are you saying from the ontological argument that the evidence for the existence of God is that we as human beings with rational minds and consciousness, because we can have some, even though we can't fully conceive of it, we have an idea of a maximally great being, and through induction, it points to the necessity of God. Is that what the argument?
That was Anselm's. That's more Anselm's argument than what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about actually does not assume that there is any evidence for God at all. It's just saying that it is possible that God exists. It is possible that some maximally great being exists. It just says it is not impossible that God exists. That's all that it's saying. And by the definition of what a maximally great being is, then if he's not impossible, then he must exist. That's what's being said here. Not that we are able to understand that because we have reason and we can conceive something. Like I said, I think that is a very elegant bit of reasoning, but it's not the most robust argument, and it's definitely not what I'm talking about here with the modal argument.
Okay, so your argument is basically an argument from irrationality, ratio absurdum, or by elimination. So you eliminated the possibility that there is no God, and thereby then prove there is God. No. What I'm talking about here, and you can see it in the name, the ontological argument says the ontological argument for the existence of God is essentially an argument for the existence of God based on the nature of God. And so what it's saying is, we all can agree, and philosophers do generally agree, that what we call God can be called a maximally great being. And so it says, given that nature, necessity being a part of that, if it's possible that God exists, then he must exist, because that's what he is. He is necessary. And so most of the objections to God and this argument specifically are, well, God is impossible. he's not possible. Or maybe a little more finer detail, they may argue something like necessity isn't a great making property, and therefore God doesn't have to have it, and therefore he's a contingent being and doesn't necessarily exist in this world. Yes?
So we are defining God in terms of his properties, essentially. Is there any way to know what those properties are without just stating that there are great making properties? Like, how are we able to intuit that love is a better property to have than hate? It might seem obvious to us, but how can we intuitively quantify what is better to have than to not have? How can we say that it's better to, or how do we know that control, for one aspect, is not a great making property? Because we would assume if you have way too much control, it can, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And of course you would say, the other property of love might say that no, the control would not corrupt, or the power would not corrupt. But how is there a way to measurably define which properties are defined as great?
That's a little difficult. That's in getting a bit beyond this, but there is an answer to this. One is to say, well, that's kind of what the moral argument talks about. One of the four big areas of study in philosophy in general is ethics. How do we know what's right? Like a whole field of study on that topic. And the moral argument for God would say, well, they exist, and everybody would agree. Well, most everybody would agree they exist. And then the argument goes from there, and we're not going to go too much deeper into that. But one way that you could say is thinking, okay, well, what properties are derivative? What properties come from other ones or are dependent on them? C.S. Lewis talked about how goodness is able to be done for its own sake. You can't do badness, or at least no one's ever heard of badness done for the sake of badness. The closest that people will come, as he says, is cruelty. But even then, usually people are cruel to others because it gives them pleasure, it gives them a sense of power, or it maybe keeps them safe. And all those are good things. They're not bad things, we would all agree. However, you could also say that good things or good or great making properties are things that you can do for themselves. You can do something good or do something right without consideration for whether it makes you feel good, or what you can just do it because it's the right thing. You could stereotype. You could help the old lady across the street because strictly because it's the right thing to do, even if it completely inconveniences you, and you, like, say you're late and you're about to miss the bus that's across the street, but you say, no, I got to help her across the street. So that's one way to think about it. What properties are derivative of the other ones? What properties are dependent on others to actually make sense? Yes?
Kind of coming from that, got me thinking about whether there was an objective standard of value that determined these great-making properties, or is it just relative to other things?
Repeat the last bit, the relative to what? I'm sorry.
Are the great-making properties based on an ethics that is rooted in objectively defined values, or is it just relative to things that are considered important?
Well, one way to respond to that would be to talk about how relativism doesn't hold water. But another way to say it is just saying for the sake of argument. You say, okay, well, God exists. If, like, for the sake of this argument, if God exists, then yes, they would be objective. But you could also say that that as soon as you concede that these great making properties may or may not be great, then you also concede that the lesser making properties are not so lesser. I mean, if you say that knowledge has a great making property is only relative, well then ignorance as a lesser making property is only relative. And even if people might say that the good things are maybe relative, there are even fewer people who will say that the bad things are also relative. That's usually the objection with the problem of evil from people who do not necessarily believe in an objective good of some kind. They'll say, well, there's all this bad, but if you say that good is relative, then there's no way to judge whether it's bad. So it doesn't necessarily help figuring out which is which, but it does say they're out there in some form. Yes, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. It makes a lot of sense to me now, like from what you're saying about the necessity of being like a maximally great trait and stuff, but then I think my question now is like, what's like the main context in which the ontological argument is normally used? Since you're saying like it wasn't used so much in like persuasive scenarios. But like I know you're saying it was used mainly like to show the possibility of God, but like what like are some example of contexts that people have used it in?
Well, Alvin Plantinga, it's one of his, as far as I can recall, his only other really big subject of discussion that is widely known is his actual tackling of the problem of evil with his defense of free will. So, I mean, and as far as I can recall, at least recently, he was the one, if not the most, one of the most cited philosophers in the world. And so, I mean, there's that. But I can't remember, I'll need to find it, but I can't remember off the top of my head, but there is a philosopher who specifically said that I am convinced by this argument. I thought it was flawed, the ontological argument was flawed, and then I was shown the modal form of it, and he even would say, in this quote, he says, I must reluctantly conclude that God exists. So you could say that it is, unless you can find a way to say that God is impossible, it is irrefutable, because that's the only premise that is up for debate, and the rest of it is completely coherent based on it. And so there's that. Although, because of the more philosophical nature and the headier nature of this argument, it is more difficult to understand, and so it's often better to consider it from a technical, explanatory argument, not necessarily a persuasive one. You could say that, and generally most theist philosophers or apologists would not even use a single argument anyway, but it's not one argument that you could say, that you could hold up and say, this is the knockdown. It's better used in conjunction with other arguments for the existence of God. Yes?
So basically, the biblical Christian worldview assumes that everybody knows this God already.
Mm-hmm.
So in the context of Christianity, what use would this argument have in conversations and daily life and devotion?
Well, it would be something that you could say, because sometimes this happens where say there isn't any God. They're just suddenly they have this feeling God doesn't exist, despite what I believe to be true. And I read a couple of accounts of that sort of thing happening, and while they would say that God lifted that. And an example, you could, like, if someone's struggling with that, is like, well, I don't know if God exists. I don't see. There are reasons that seem to say that He doesn't. You could say, okay, well, is it still possible? Do you believe it's still possible that God could exist? And then if their answer is yes, you could say, okay, well then look at this, and in the context of the church or a Christian worldview, there's a scripture that would back this up as well and say, all right, well, God has to exist. He couldn't not exist. And so as long as there's a possibility that he exists, then he is real. And then goes on from there. Yes.
So, what about the scary monster objection?
Describe it for me.
Basically, it's taking the same form as the ontological argument, except where it says maximally great being, it says a maximally scary monster. So it's basically doing an reductio ad absurdum to the form of the ontological argument.
I'll admit I have encountered this, but I cannot recall off the top of my head exactly how to respond to this properly, so I'll see what I can do. You could say that if it's the reverse, if it's supposed to be like the reverse ontological argument, great making properties don't entail their opposite on one hand. So if you were to say here's a question: is necessity a scary making property as a possibility with that?
Sure.
I'm sort of okay.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, even like if I have a monster in my nightmare terror, it would be even more scary if that monster were to actually exist.
Right. Okay. Oh my.
That sounds more like it's akin to Anselm's. It seems like is a crude adaptation from objections to Anselm's argument about existing greater. It would be greater to exist in real world than it would be to exist in the mind. So saying it's bad if a scary monster exists in my mind, but it would be even scarier or worse if this creature existed in real world. So it seems like it's just an adaptation of that. In which case, I would kind of go down the same lines. Is the property of existence truly a greater property than non-existence, or is existence a property? I don't
And another way to talk about this then is there are other ways in the most direct response. Unfortunately, I do not recall, so I will just concede deficiency in that. However, you could also say there is a difference between logical possibility and metaphysical possibility. Basically, logical possibility says there is some world where this could exist. However, metaphysical possibility is not only that, but it's also there are actual reasons to suppose that this exists. So there are additional reasons beyond his definition to say that God does exist. But there is not necessarily any reasons beyond this scary monster's definition to exist. And so you could say that's adaptation or a parody of the modal ontological argument, because it's just dealing with logical possibility, not the more stringent metaphysical. There's not really any other reason to suppose the monster exists.
I mean, like with scariness in general, wouldn't it be more subjective? Because mostly based on like personal fears and experiences, because different people have like different conceptions of scariness that are normally based on like their life or like something happened to them or just something that they're like more afraid of. Whereas goodness, you can like you have your system of measuring that, where you can say like it's something that's like not like you do not like for does not a derivative of something. There's really no system for scariness. So I don't know if it's a trait that can be treated in like the same way as like greatness, where you can actually base an argument off of it.
That's a possibility. I hadn't considered that, but I guess the only thing that I would say is that is a possibility, but then it also someone could also say, well, we're defining it as like necessity. It does have a specific objective, meaning for it. And if you want to sort of say that, then it wouldn't be hard to look in literature for something like that. You just look for H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos. Basically, all of the great old ones are elder gods. They are, by definition, terrifying because they are beyond the pale of human comprehension. And so they might be able to say, that is scariness for the monster. Find something more objective. And then the objection still holds, or still stands on that basis.
Couldn't that like be like the ultimate scariness be like within the Christian context, like hell? Something like couldn't you still have like an ultimate scariness within the Christian context? Like you'd like because it probably wouldn't really be like some ridiculous monster, probably would actually be like the ultimate of scariness if you found some way to objectify that.
I'm going to say yes and no, just if we're talking in the Christian context. Yes, because actually, like if we think of fear of God as not just respect, but also in some way, I am literally afraid of God, then yes, because God would be, in that sense, then the scariest thing in existence. However, I'd also have to say no on that, just because, like what you brought up, humans are not maximum in any way. And so it would not be possible for them to experience the maximum fear or scariness of God in that sense. But even then, that's changing the definition of what scary would be for this objection. So, I mean, it's an interesting discussion, but I don't know. Yes? Okay.
When we talk about like something being maximally great, is the great itself a single property, or is that describing like a whole constellation of properties that all of these have to be possessed to the maximum to be maximally great?
Both. Yeah, in the way I've been using them specifically, it's capturing all of them, but it's also, again, I cannot remember for the life of me the philosopher, but he did, there is a philosopher who did a work that proved that greatness is a great-making property. So greatness in and of itself, which I would guess is some sort of amalgamation of all of these things, or at least would affect them.
I can see, like I haven't followed all the way through, but I can see where if it were the case where when we say maximally great, we are referring to a range of several different properties.
Yes.
That would be sort of necessary to the argument, whereas if you single out a single property like scariness or anything else, that the whole thing wouldn't follow because you're, I guess, selling a specific single property and neglecting others.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. The only reason that necessity is kind of singled out here is just because a maximally great being is pretty much the only thing other than like numbers and shapes that are necessary, and numbers and shapes are not efficacious in any way. Right, I guess I'll get one more in the back.
Getting to more abstract, sort of like mathematical philosophy, when you say maximally great, can maximum be taken to mean infinite in the context, or is there some sort of pinnacle in each of the great making properties? Can there always be one? Or is
It's maximum here is philosophical, not mathematical, and so it's to the greatest degree, whatever that is. Whether that's limitless or some pinnacle that is completely insurmountable by anything else, that it's not particularly important. The Christian would say infinite, like just completely limitless. That's what the Christian would say at least, but again, this argument is not necessary to be considered in that context. All right, well, thank you for your time, and hopefully come out understanding a little bit better what the ontological argument is. If you have any other questions, you can ask me afterwards.